Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I recognize quite a lot of you, but not everybody, so just in case I'll say my name's Gert Nonneman, I'm the Dean here at Georgetown in Qatar, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you to this wonderful occasion because as those of you who were there this lunchtime at the official launch of the International History Major will know, we just launched the International History Major, which, it bears repeating, is the only one of its kind in the whole region, the whole Middle East. And it's the, I think now, 5th major that Georgetown here is offering. Might also be called perhaps the global history, the world history major, but it's all about the interconnections and interdisciplinarity as well, which is also typical of our other majors, of our other education here. And to celebrate this and to help us celebrate it and launch it all, Dr. Benedict, the chair of the Department of History at Georgetown University in Washington, has flown across 2 oceans, so that's what it means to be global, clearly, to come and do this. And she was there, of course, this lunchtime, and she will now regale us with the lecture that you see on there. But we have a wonderful tradition here in Georgetown, which is that when we have particularly eminent speakers, we don't introduce them, the faculty or the staff or the dean doesn't introduce them. We get one of our best students to do this for us, just to showcase the kind of students that we have here, you see. And the student who will do this today is Mariam Al-Thani, who is a senior at SFS-Q. That means she's in her final year. Alas for us, but good for her. She is pursuing one of the other majors that we do here. It's the Culture and Politics major. And again, for those of you less familiar with Georgetown, that's a very peculiar major that's not available at any other university that I know of. And again, it looks at one of these intersections of different disciplines and social dynamics. She's pursuing honors for that, and what that means is that she's taking a particular special class and an additional project, an initial research project, which is very demanding, is really the privilege, the preserve only for our very best students, very brightest students. Her thesis for this honors project focuses on the history of the Islamic Center of America as a lens to understand the larger American Muslim community in Michigan. So, without further ado, over to Mariam.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by welcoming our esteemed faculty and staff, my fellow students, and of course our distinguished guest, Professor Carol Benedict, who is a professor and department chair of history at Georgetown University. History is a subject that permeates into all aspects of our lived reality. It informs our personal identities, our national identities, our cultures, our traditions, and so on. As such, clashes between history and modernization have been prominent throughout history and are still relevant today. Globalization is not a new phenomenon. Cultural exchanges between nations have been occurring for centuries now. In the past, these exchanges have been situated within an economic context along the lines of trade, and were predominantly material cultural exchanges. And these occurrences have developed throughout history to include multiple forms of exchanges. This process of cultural exchange is realized through a number of projects whose purpose is to disseminate culture and history through institutions such as museums situated both locally and internationally. Qatar has recently taken a positive step towards the preservation of cultural artifacts from both the past and the present, as well as towards the engagement in material cultural exchanges with different nations through the development of institutions like museums and other cultural hubs. Both new nations and old nations grapple with how globalization has shaped their history and how they situate themselves in the world, in the international arena. And these issues face new countries like Qatar, who are currently shaping and consolidating their national image in the world sphere, as well as old countries with a rich established history like China. And this subject area falls under the specialty of Dr. Carol Benedict, who has written extensively on the history of both imperial and modern China. And she'll be talking to us today about smoking culture and health in a globalizing China. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to express my great gratitude and thanks to the Dean and to everyone else here for inviting me to Doha. This is my first trip to Qatar, amazingly, but I am absolutely thrilled to be here. And these past few days, it's been a short visit, but I have just been very impressed with the energy, the resolve, and the exuberance which I've seen in the last couple of days. I want to also congratulate the students and the faculty of International History for their successful launch of this new major. Now, when I was first asked to come, as some of you, if you were there at the lunchtime event, you heard that I'm a historian of the social history of medicine and disease, specializing in China. And so when I first thought about coming and talking to you, I thought I would emphasize the health aspects. So I apologize to anyone who's come to hear that element, because in keeping with the launch, I decided instead to focus on the element of China in the world, which has been the theme of the International History launch. So I'm excising the health part from the title, but I'm more than happy to talk with you about the health issues about tobacco in China over the longue durée, if that's a particular interest of yours. This evening, I'd like to place the history of China in a global context, using the lens of tobacco to do so, in order to dispel what is a fairly common misperception or stereotype about imperial China even today. Despite decades of scholarship to the contrary, a perennial stereotype about imperial China persists in textbooks, in newspaper accounts, in common knowledge, as China as an isolated empire in the early modern period. And by early modern period, I mean roughly 1500 to 1800. This standard image, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the idea that China was a distinct, discrete civilization, a bounded Confucian civilization that was impervious to external influences until in the mid-19th century it was forcibly opened by the British during the Opium Wars of the 19th century. And so this narrative goes forward as China approached the late 19th and early 20th century. The forces of global industrial capitalism washed over China just as it did many other societies around the world, bringing with it new commodities, new industrial forms, mass-produced items like the global cigarette, which transformed Chinese life, for better or for worse, irrevocably. And again, this narrative is one of a static China, one that is bounded, that is closed to outside influences, and that is transformed only with the intervention of European or North American influences. That is the stereotype I'd like to try to dispel this evening. Now, the notion that China was implacably hostile to foreigners or indifferent to imported ideas or goods, which this stereotype persists in relaying, before its 19th century encounter with the West, is reinforced by an oft-cited assertion made by the Qianlong Emperor in the 18th century. And again, if you studied Chinese history, you've probably read this text. This is in the famous letter that the Qianlong Emperor, who reigned from 1736 to 1795, in a 1793 letter to King George III. And I won't read you the whole letter, but the relevant passage here is when Qianlong very majestically says to the king, quote, "We have never valued ingenious articles, nor do we have the slightest need of your country's manufactures," dismissing Lord Macartney's mission that was there to discuss possible foreign trade options with the Chinese emperor. So Qianlong's rhetorical assertion excuse me, of self-sufficiency and disdain for foreign wares actually masked a very complex historical reality. While it is certainly the case that China could be very cautious and deliberate in its encounters with foreigners, especially with Europeans, it in fact has a very long history of engagement and interaction with the outside world. For centuries, goods and ideas have flowed into and out of China. And we know this, we all know this. Yesterday I was at the Museum of Islamic Art and saw the beautiful Persian carpets that had within them dragons that were borrowed, the dragon motif from China, or the 7th century earthenware bowl, which was certainly Islamic in form and content, but it was modeled on Chinese porcelain. So we know that across the Silk Road, ideas have flowed from China. What is less well recognized, I think, is that the Chinese have continually borrowed institutions, inventions, products, and procedures, and then adapted them to Chinese purposes. The Chinese empire, just like most cultures, is a multicultural one. It's one that has borrowed and adapted and appropriated over the millennium. So the subject of my talk tonight, the history of tobacco in China from 1550 to the present, both in the early modern period, circa 1500 to 1800, and the modern period, about 1800 to the present, really tries to engage two different themes that we have heard a lot about today in this launch of the International History major. The first theme is engagement with the external world. And the second theme is indigenization, that is, the ongoing process whereby foreign goods and ideas become Chinese or became Chinese to the point that we, or even the Chinese themselves, don't recognize that they originally were imported ideas, goods, or products. Okay, why tobacco? Well, tobacco, many of you may know, is a New World crop. It was indigenous to the Peruvian highlands originally, but in the 16th century, tobacco was one of those New World crops that very quickly went global. It became a globalized plant in the 16th century. It did so quite rapidly. In the early 1600s, it was pretty much around ports around the world. And by 1750, it was already widely cultivated in China as elsewhere. By the 18th century, tobacco use in China was pervasive, and it was used by all segments of society, by both genders, by men, women, and even children. Most of the tobacco consumed in China was produced within the boundaries of the empire, and it was traded locally. This was after, of course, tobacco was initially imported and began to be cultivated. But imported tobaccos from Japan, from Korea, from Southeast Asia, snuff produced in Portugal but made from Brazilian tobacco, water pipe tobacco that originally entered China along the Silk Roads from Iran or from the Ottoman territories, or even from the Indian Ocean realm. And later on, in the 19th century, hand-rolled cigars and cigarettes that were made from tobacco grown in the Philippines and imported into China from the Philippines. All of these found a market in late imperial China, in Qing China. And when I say Qing China, I'm really talking about the last imperial dynasty that stretched from 1644 until 1911. So by the end of this talk, I hope I will have persuaded you that China has been globalizing. That's an overused word, I know, but at least that it was globally connected for much longer than perhaps you had previously thought. Tobacco swept into China on the wave of early modern globalization that carried it to other parts of the world, including those in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in India, Iran, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. It was long a plant that was cultivated in South and North America, and it was one of the first things that Columbus and his crew encountered when they arrived in Hispaniola in 1492. Now, Columbus and his men thought that this was a fairly, well, first of all, they couldn't figure out why the Indians, the Amerindians, were handing over these dried leaves that seemed to have no utility or use. And moreover, it seemed quite diabolical that the Amerindians were actually puffing away and creating smoke. And so Columbus just threw the leaves overboard. It took a while for the settlers, the Spanish settlers in the Americas, to figure out, hey, this is pretty cool stuff, right? And gradually over time, they became to be habituated to it. It took even longer for Europeans to figure out that this was a commercially profitable plant. And so it wasn't really until about the 1590s that large amounts of American-grown tobacco began to be imported into Europe for sale. But by then, Spanish and Portuguese merchants and sailors had carried tobacco to ports around the world, including those that I mentioned earlier in Southeast Asia, Japan, China, and so on. So by the early 17th century, tobacco had started to go global. And in fact, the kind of breakout years were from about 1570 to 1620. So historians who've looked at tobacco in various places around the world find that in places like Manila, in the Philippines, Indonesia, Nagasaki in Japan, Bengal in India, Mocha in Yemen, Kilwa in Eastern Africa, Istanbul, I mean, you can go on down the list. Between about 1570 and 1620, you begin to see records of tobacco arriving on these shores. This is the same process by which it washed up into China. But the introduction of New World tobacco into China was a complex process that followed many routes and involved many different agents. And some of you have a map that is from my book on this subject. And it shows basically 4 entry points of tobacco into China. And I'm just going to rehearse those 4 different routes. The first one is along the southeast coast of China, and the tobacco entered along the southeast coast, the area that we now know as Hong Kong and Canton. And it spread up the Chinese coast, and eventually it spread along into the North China Plain. The agents that brought tobacco to China, the southeast coast, were the Portuguese, who carried tobacco from Brazil to their colony, newly established colony in Goa, and from there to their even more newly established colony in Macau. Secondly, the Spanish carried tobacco from the Americas across the Pacific Ocean to their newly established colony in Manila, and there either Catholic friars who were seeking to establish missions in China, or perhaps a Chinese merchant who was located in Manila, brought the plant back to the province of Fujian. In any event, by 1611, it's clearly a well-established crop along the southeast coast of China. That's the first extant source that we have. It dates from 1611. We also have the accounts of European travelers. For example, an ill-fated Spaniard named Adriano de la Cortez was shipwrecked along the southeastern coast in 1625. He was taken hostage because at that time the Spanish were prohibited from coming to China. He was taken hostage and he was very, very parched, and he was miming, trying to indicate just how thirsty he was. And the Chinese, as is their custom, brought him hot boiled water to drink. And this was not what he intended. He thought he would be getting cool water. And so he mimicked again what he needed, and then they brought him a tobacco pipe. And so he was very surprised that the Chinese already had tobacco. By the 1630s, tobacco, as I said, had spread up the coast to the northern plain, and it was widespread throughout Beijing and much of northern China, despite the fact that there was an imperial edict against its use, and it was a capital crime to be found smoking tobacco. The second route, again referring to your map, is into the northeast, what we now call Manchuria, by way of Japan and Korea. Tobacco probably arrived in Japan in the 1570s, although the first definite time we know it was there is 1605. And we know this because the factor, the director of the British East India Company at the trading post in Hirado, Japan, wrote in his famous diary, Richard Cox's diary, in 1615, he wrote, quote, "It is strange to see these Japanese, men, women, and children, are besotted in drinking that herb." And by the way, here in the 16th, 17th century, the Europeans, the Chinese, Japanese, they all referred to it as drinking tobacco, inhaling it. They're besotted in drinking that herb, and not 10 years hence since it was first used. From Japan, the plant spread to Korea, probably by 1616, and then the Koreans were selling it to the Manchus in the 1620s. Now the Manchus, for those of you who don't know Chinese history, they are the conquest dynasty who displaced the Ming and became the Qing. So they're on their way up, but first they have to get besotted with tobacco. By the 1630s, we have records of tobacco cultivation in Manchuria, and again, the leader of the Manchus at that time had sent down an edict that anyone caught planting, smoking, or selling tobacco was to be beheaded. So this was the initial reaction to this plant. Now these two roots are fairly well known to those who study the diffusion of New World crops to East Asia. But what's less well known is that there were other routes that tobacco entered China, and these are the third and fourth ones that I want to highlight now. In the 16th century, the western bordered region of China, adjacent to Burma, it's now the province of Yunnan, was actually more oriented to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean realm than it was to imperial China. Scholars who have studied trade relations between India, Burma, and southwestern China have described the routes leading into China as the southwestern Silk Road. These are branches of the Silk Road, the more famous Silk Road, that linked Sichuan and Yunnan, two provinces of China, to Burma and eastern India. The Portuguese brought tobacco to the eastern coast of India around the same time they brought it to the southeastern coast of China. And it fairly quickly diffused both into South Asia, but also to the communities that surround the Bay of Bengal in the eastern Indian Ocean. European travelers reported seeing tobacco smokers in Malaya in 1608, in Burma in 1616, in Siam, what we now call Thailand, in 1622, and Vietnam in 1631. Now, trade between Burma and the Chinese province of Yunnan in the late 16th century was incredibly brisk. And those of you who know the terrain know that this might be surprising, because in order to trade between those two countries, you actually have to travel fairly treacherous mountain terrain and, violently turbulent rivers and so on. But the reason that trade relations were so brisk is because Burmese gemstones were very much in demand by Chinese elites. So pu'er tea, Chinese tea, Yunnan silver, silk, weapons, copper and iron vessels, all were carried from China to Burma, and then in exchange, Burmese rubies, amber, jade, elephant tusks from South Asia, Indian textiles, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, which, by the way, remained the monetary system of Yunnan well into the 17th century. These all were carried into Yunnan from Burma. One 1580s report reports 200 merchants and 30 heavily loaded boats with these commodities headed up the Irrawaddy River in Burma towards the Chinese frontier. Now, unfortunately, for my purposes, there are no extant records saying for sure that tobacco was among these cargoes. But we do know that farmers in southwestern China and Yunnan were growing tobacco as well as other New World crops in the early 17th century. So the presumption is that, and because farmers further to the east in Yunnan were not doing so, the presumption is that the orientation of southwestern China to the Indian Ocean realm was the route by which tobacco made it into the far west of of China. This is my global map. So here we have a picture of Southeast Asian water pipes, Hmong pipes in Southeast Asia. And the point I want to make here is that in far western Yunnan today, this is actually from the 1990s, so it's a bit dated, the photo, but still the bong-type water pipe, which is pervasive throughout Southeast Asia, is still a way in which people enjoy tobacco in southwest China today. All right, the final route is across Central Eurasia. This is tobacco coming into China from the far west into the far western part of China. Again, we know that the far western territories of China participated in long-distance trade networks across Central Eurasia, that China had long-standing ties to Russia, India, the Ottoman Empire. And at this time, in this period of time, it was mediated by the Bukharins, we now call them Uzbeks, along the Silk Road. We also know that already in the early 17th century, tobacco was being cultivated in Western India. It was being cultivated in Persia, in Ottoman territories, in Moldavia. It's reported to have been present in Kandahar in 1621, in the Turan Depression, which we now call southwestern Kazakhstan, northwestern Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. We know that there was tobacco acquired from Iran in the early 1600s. However it got there, by the early 17th century, a particular species of tobacco was being cultivated in China's far western province of Gansu in the early 17th century. And this is, again, it's a type of tobacco that was originated in the Peruvian highlands and somehow ended up on the other side of the world fairly soon after Columbus first, 100 plus years, right? But that's fairly soon, I would say, in global time. Fairly soon after Columbus first saw it. Gansu also became the center for this special type of water pipe tobacco that came to be highly desired throughout much of China. I should mention here that Lanzhou, the capital of Gansu, was a crossroad for the classic Silk Roads. So again, this is a cosmopolitan place that has long seen this kind of interaction and exchange. Water pipes and water pipe tobacco, which were utilized, still are utilized throughout the Islamic world and the Indian Ocean realm, also became the preferred mode and the preferred type of tobacco in the far western part of China. And again, we don't have good documentation of when it actually appeared in these areas, but it was likely dispersed along the Central Eurasian caravan networks that linked Lanzhou to Xinjiang and to the empires of Russia, India, and the Middle East. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the many different routes by which tobacco arrived in China demonstrates the very trans-regional networks of long-distance trade that China participated in the 16th and 17th century, some of which are not well documented in the historical literature. These 4 points of the compass that I've highlighted show the intricate trade networks that linked China to Southeast Asia, to the Indian Ocean realm, to Central Eurasia, India, the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. Tobacco's presence in the interior of the Eurasian continent, including China's far western borderlands, underscores what I'm arguing is the growing interconnectedness of the early modern global world and China's participation in that world. In the interactive zones of China's borderlands, those that I've just mentioned, the 4 corners, tobacco began its transformation from a foreign product to an indigenized local Chinese product. Between 1650 and 1750, entrepreneurial migrant Chinese farmers who saw some profit to be made in the growing of tobacco, moving from the borderlands to the interior of China, began cultivating this new plant in China's highlands and began selling it to long-distance traders who then carried it to many parts of the Chinese empire. As I said earlier, by the 1750s, China had become an important domestic cash crop. In many regions, it had become very much a part of everyday life and everyday culture. And in the mid-18th century, some 900,000 acres were under cultivation in terms of Chinese tobacco. Now that doesn't really say very much, but if we use a comparative measure, that's as much as the Chinese, that's as much acreage as was under cultivation for tea, and almost as much as was under cultivation for cotton. And I have documentation of the importance of tobacco for the empire in terms of taxation. So in some of the customs houses, it represented a huge proportion, a huge percentage of the revenues that the Chinese government was gaining from tobacco. And suffice to say that it was a mainstay of many local and regional economies by the 1750s, and it served as a revenue source and a livelihood for millions of farmers, merchants, traders, and vendors, and officials in terms of forms of taxation. In the early 18th century, the Yongzheng and the Qianlong emperor both tried to shut down tobacco cultivation. They felt that tobacco was a waste. It was not a nutritious food that people could eat. It just basically was a luxury that, was wasteful of good arable land. But they found themselves opposed by local and provincial officials from tobacco growing areas who argued, much as the China National Tobacco Corporation does today, that in fact, in the words of one Qing official, it's an everyday product consumed by tens of millions, and moreover, it creates wealth rather than squanders it. So some of the same issues we deal with today. Now, during the High Qing, and by High Qing I mean the period from about 1680 to about 1790, tobacco use was pervasive throughout Chinese society, and it was socially inclusive. This is a bit of an Orientalist picture, but I don't have another one to show you. So this shows a high official smoking his long Chinese pipe. It was also used by women, including elite women, and it was even used by children. I have a picture of a child smoking, but I didn't include it this evening. But here we have a picture of a peasant family, and the peasant woman is smoking her pipe. So the point here is that it crossed all socioeconomic classes and all occupational groups and both genders and all ages. By the 18th century, there were basically two tiers of production and consumption. So what was called native tobacco, locally grown cut tobacco, was just grown by farmers in their field and then traded locally. But we also had expensive premium regional tobaccos that were grown in particular districts that could fetch a really high price in the cities of China. This was desired by the urban elite and could be sold at very high prices. Merchants, and this gets back to my theme of engagement, merchants also sold imported tobaccos from Japan or Korea or Southeast Asia. And merchants also exported Chinese tobacco to Southeast Asia, where there was a large overseas Chinese population who preferred Chinese tobacco to any other, but there was also a huge market in Siberia, Central Asia, and even Russia. And this, by the way, if anyone's looking for a dissertation topic, this has not been examined. It's very well documented in the local archives, the trade between China and Russia in the 18th century in terms of the tobacco trade. Now, at first, all Chinese smokers, all Chinese tobacco users used tobacco in the classic Chinese pipe, the long pipe, which, if you know about Amerindian culture, you'll know that this is actually an appropriation and adaptation of the Amerindian tobacco pipe. But whether Mandarin or farmer, this is the way that people smoked tobacco initially. Gradually over time, the elite began to get a bit queasy about the fact that they were smoking tobacco in exactly the same way as the farmer or the laborer. And so gradually over time, a dynamic fashion system of consumption began to develop in tobacco consumption, whereby the elite were able to set themselves apart from their social inferiors in terms of the kinds of tobacco they smoked. I already mentioned the highly priced regional tobaccos, but more importantly, in the modes of use, the way in which people consume tobacco. So by 1750 or so, there was a socially stratified divergence in the modes of consumption as well as in the types of tobacco used. Those of lower social status continued to use this pipe, the long pipe, but the wealthy elite increasingly switched to snuff and highly priced water pipe tobacco. Now, snuff, if you don't know, it's a finely powdery tobacco that you put in your nose and inhale it. I guess it's like cocaine, I don't know. You inhale it, and then you get a really quick buzz from nicotine. Apparently, you have to keep your handkerchief very handy because the subsequent physiological processes are not all that pleasant. But in any event, it's nose tobacco, right? So the Qing culture of snuff, it's an interesting illustration of my two themes, because both the cosmopolitan engagement and indigenization. Because snuff, which had been enjoyed by Amerindians for millennia, came to be used in Europe in the late 17th century when the Spanish and Portuguese began to develop this. Snuff developed because you were not supposed to smoke during fasting periods, but there was no papal edict against snuff. Seemed to have a different classification, so the Catholics in Spain and Portugal began to use snuff in lieu of pipe tobacco. In any event, in the 18th century, snuff became all the rage in European capitals, particularly in France. The Jesuits carried it to the Qing court, to the Chinese court, and it became very fashionable in the Chinese court in the 18th century as well. The Chinese developed a very highly developed culture of snuff and snuffing. You may know about the snuff bottles that the Chinese developed. The Qing culture of snuff displays an exuberant cosmopolitanism. Even though in the humid conditions of China they didn't use snuff boxes as were used in Europe, they did develop snuff bottles. An innovation that was based on the European culture of snuff. Culture of snuff. Snuff bottles themselves positively celebrated the foreign. They were constructed and made out of nephrite jade from eastern Turkestan, coral from the Japan Sea, jadeite and amber from Burma, painted enamels on gold, copper, and glass, a technique that the Chinese learned from Swiss and French Jesuits. They were carved from ivory from southern Africa and from Asia, or made from amber from the Baltic Sea. And some, as you see here, were painted with European subjects. And snuff always had an association with the foreign and particularly with the European. So again, here's a snuff bottle with European subjects. Others replicated European watch faces, which was another, by the way, imported item that was incredibly fashionable among Chinese elite in the 18th century. It wasn't just the bottles themselves that showed the association of China or the engagement of China with the outside world. The 18th century Chinese actually imported snuff, and the most highly valued imported snuff was that produced in Portugal, made from tobacco produced in Brazil. And just as an aside here, in the 18th century, Brazilian twist tobacco had the largest global market in the world. It had well-established markets in North America, among North American Indians and India, and on and on. Again, another fascinating topic. But a particular kind of Brazilian snuff, known as amostrina, was that which was favored by the Chinese. And it was imported into 18th century China via the Portuguese colony of Macau, and it fetched a very high price. Towards the end of the 18th century, other foreign merchants were quite eager to get into the Chinese snuff trade. And so, for example, the second American ship, the second US ship to sail to China after the Revolutionary War ended and the United States was actually able to send its own ships without the control of the British East India Company. The second American ship to sail to Canton after gaining independence in 1786. Its primary cargo was snuff made from Chesapeake-grown tobacco. And even though they got there and they found out that the Chinese didn't like Chesapeake tobacco, they wanted the Brazilian stuff, so it was kind of a failed venture. But anyway, American ships continued to carry snuff and cut tobacco to China until they figured out that opium actually was probably a better bet, Turkish opium. In any event, by the end of the 19th century, there were many varieties of imported snuff in China's major cities. French, Austrian, Germany, Cuban, Philippines. And then let's not forget that Asian traders were there too, so Parsi traders sold Persian, Arabian, and Indian varieties. All of this received a welcome in China. The second mode of consumption that I want to highlight that illustrates my two central themes of engagement and indigenization is the water pipe. This is the classic Chinese water pipe that was used to smoke tobacco in the 19th century. And as with the snuff bottles and snuff tobacco, the Chinese indigenized this pipe. The Chinese themselves tend to think of this as part of ancient Chinese culture, an essentialized aspect of Chinese culture. But in fact, it's a fairly recent innovation that was borrowed from the Indian Ocean realm and the Islamic world in the 18th century. This is really an adaptation of water pipes that first developed in the southern coast of India and then spread to the Middle East, the kind of forms that we know of as the hookah or the negril or the shisha, whatever. So the Chinese elaborated this, made it more convenient in a handheld product. Another elaboration. And also, I want to mention two other products that found a market in China. First of all, opium. It's a little known fact that smokable opium had been medicinal in China for centuries, but smokable opium actually came into China in the 17th and 18th century as a combination of opium and tobacco. So it was the introduction of smokable tobacco that made it possible for smokable opium to get inroads into China. And initially it was smoked together, opium and tobacco, in a form called madak. Another product that found favor in China in the 19th century were hand-rolled cigars and cigarettes that were imported from the Philippines. And this was called Luzon tobacco. And those of you who can read Chinese can see that this is a Luzon tobacco shop from the early 20th century. All right, so these hand-rolled products were precursors to the modern machine-rolled cigarette that began to be marketed in China in the 1880s and 1890s. Now cigarettes, and here I'm shifting from the early modern period to the modern period. Cigarettes in China as elsewhere are associated with modern industrial capitalism and as one of the first, and with the kind of Western mass consumer culture that is assumed to have emerged along with industrialization. The cigarette, to be sure, was one of the first mass-marketed commodities that went global. After it began to be rolled by machine in the 1880s, it was produced in high volumes in a standardized product and it was marketed using graphic-rich advertising in markets around the world, including Qing, China. And because of this fact, it's often thought of in China, as elsewhere, as emblematic of the homogenizing forces of modern global capitalism. Or the word we sometimes use is westernization, right? Now, it's undeniable that transnational tobacco firms based in Great Britain or the United States, most notably British American Tobacco, were major players in the globalization of the modern cigarette. But in fact, and this is how they tried to hook the Chinese consumer in the early 1900s. I find it interesting that they're marketing with using traditional-looking women, but that's a whole nother story. In fact, cigarettes themselves were not entirely new. Tobacco wrapped in bark or leaves had been used by Amur Indians for centuries. Hand-rolled cigarettes known as bunkus, bidis, or cheroots were found throughout the eastern sector of the Indian Ocean, the Indonesian archipelago, the Malayan Peninsula, the Philippines, and so on from the 1660s on. The Spanish in the 17th century, perhaps having seen these uses in South America or perhaps in Southeast Asia, began to roll what they called papelettes. This was tobacco that was wrapped in fine paper. And the French, never to be outdone, in the 1830s decided to take these Spanish papelettes and call them cigarettes. Cigarettes, hand-rolled tobacco and fine paper were popular in Russia in the 1840s, in England also in the 1840s. They made inroads in Egypt in the 1850s and in the United States during the American Civil War. But it was mechanization and the development of a particular type of tobacco that allowed the cigarette to go truly global and become a mass-marketed commodity. In the 19th century, cigarettes were rolled by hand. This made them luxury products that were quite expensive and really out of the reach of the mass consumer. In the 1840s, however, in the Piedmont region of Virginia in the United States, farmers developed a particular way of curing tobacco using high-intensity heat. This is the so-called bright tobacco that is flue cured instead of sun or air cured. The significance of flue curing was that it made tobacco very easily inhalable. It was actually quite difficult to inhale the harsh tobacco that was cured by sun or by air into one's lungs. But flue-cured bright tobacco was acidic, actually, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it was more acidic, so therefore it was easily inhalable into the lungs. This also made it more deadly, by the way. Here's my health plug, right? So once flue curing came to be used, and in 1881, when James Bonsack developed the Bonsack rolling machine, this provided the preconditions for the cigarette to become mass-produced and to go truly global. Now, the point I want to make here is that even though North American and European firms brought the machine-rolled cigarette to China, they did so. The reason that it became so popular in China is that the foundations were already laid for this centuries earlier. As I've been arguing, tobacco use was already pervasive in China when foreign firms began marketing the cigarette rolled by machine. And although the cigarette was introduced by foreign companies, the cigarette was, as I said, dependent on that earlier usage. They didn't have to persuade the Chinese to smoke, they simply had to persuade them, hey, this is a more convenient, sanitary way to smoke tobacco than you had previously. And also, as I previously noted, there was a dynamic fashion system of tobacco consumption already in place, whereby elite consumers were seeking to distinguish themselves from their social inferiors. So the marketing genius of British American Tobacco and other companies was to argue that, hey, if you smoke Garrick cigarettes, or if you smoke State Express 555s, which, by the way, was the most popular brand in the early 20th century in China, Chesterfield's, Lucky Strike, or Camels, you can distinguish yourself as one of the cognoscenti, of one of the dynamic, progressive urban people in China. And this is precisely what happened. Those who had previously distinguished themselves by snuffing tobacco or by using the silver water pipe instead turned to cigarettes, which were being marketed as modern and Western and convenient and hygienic, all attributes of which appealed to the Chinese urban progressive urban consumer in the early 20th century. Needless to say, foreign companies had enormous success in China. Between 1900 and 1937, the cigarette market exploded, so that in 1900 there were 300 million sticks produced, and by 1937 there were over 80 billion in production and in sales. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize here is that cigarettes in China, as in Egypt and in many other markets around the world, were thought of, they weren't just marketed by companies as such, but they were thought of as modern. Again, emblematic of modernity. Chinese writers similarly associated the cigarette with the West, with modernity, with dynamism, with individualism. And in fact, there's a great deal of Chinese literature from the early 20th century basically marking out the Chinese water pipe as agrarian, leisurely, rural, backward, stagnant, all the other tropes, right? Whereas the cigarette is thought of as, progressive, so on and so forth. And as a result of this, within the context that China was facing, as so many other cultures around the world, of being impacted by foreign cultural and economic imperialism, not to say military insecurities vis-a-vis the Western powers in Japan, there was a great deal of ambivalence about the foreign cigarette among Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century. And so it was regarded with some degree of suspicion. However, the same authors who wrote about how horrible it was that Westernization was rolling over China in the form of the cigarette, they liked their State Express 555s nonetheless. So it's undeniable that manufactured cigarettes first developed in British and American factories and then were exported around the world. But what's often overlooked is that the Chinese, no less than the Egyptians and others, fairly quickly indigenized the cigarette. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't sound all that appealing, right? But this is the most popular brand by a Chinese-owned company, believe it or not. So foreign companies fairly early on had to compete with Chinese-owned companies producing cigarettes, both in the machine-rolled and also the hand-rolled versions. The mechanized companies were by and large quite small relative to companies like British American Tobacco, but some of them were extraordinarily successful. So Huacheng Tobacco came to be the second largest Chinese owned factory, or second largest Chinese owned company selling cigarettes in China and elsewhere. And this was its most popular brand, the Rat. It has an auspicious meaning in Chinese, okay? People liked it there. But in addition to the machine-rolled plants of Chinese-owned cigarette factories, there were also companies that rolled cigarettes by hand, making them in coarsely rolled cigarettes that were marketed to laborers and to workers. So there was a wide range of cigarette products on the market produced in China that had nothing to do with foreign factories. And this brings me back to my theme of indigenization. In fact, the biggest competitors to British American Tobacco in the 1930s were not companies like Huacheng, but instead were small workshops that rolled hundreds and thousands of cigarettes by hand using primarily female laborers who were paid at very, very low rates, but who were exceedingly skilled. And they could hand-roll cigarettes in pirated cigarette papers that looked virtually identical to machine-made, factory-produced cigarettes. And they also saved on advertising by slipstreaming on the brands of the major companies. So this is an example of some hand-rolled cigarettes that were slipstreaming on the Rat brand, but there were others that slipstreamed on BAT brands and so on. In 1934, the hand-rolling industry accounted for 25% of the Chinese cigarette market. And this was a constant irritant for the major tobacco companies, including British American Tobacco, which was constantly telling the Chinese government, you gotta deal with these, these pirators, these counterfeiters, these people who are getting away with brand infringement and so on. But what we should recognize is that these hand-rolling workshops that produce cigarettes in a traditional way, using tried and true methodologies that were more akin to a classical traditional workshop than to a modern factory, actually played a major role in diffusing the so-called modern cigarette to consumers at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So when you see all these pictures of Chinese smokers in the 1920s and 1930s, you have to wonder, are these ladies actually smoking a British American tobacco cigarette made in a Shanghai factory, or are they smoking a cigarette that was made in a traditional, so-called traditional workshop? We just don't know, right? It's hard to tell. And then you get pictures like this, which shows, a youngster at a, basically a soup kitchen, smoking what's clearly a kind of hand-rolled cigarette, possibly as was done with recycled tobacco that was swept off of the floors of theaters and opera houses and so on, and then resold. So the modern cigarette is a very complicated notion, right? Just because it's a cigarette doesn't necessarily mean it's this homogenized, westernized product that we have come to think of it as. So this notion that the cigarette is a symbol of westernization or global homogenization, it's not that this is wrong, because in fact we can't deny the fact that the origins of the modern cigarette around the world was the importation of machine-rolled cigarettes on the part of foreign companies and so on. But the problem is that it's not wrong, but it overlooks the much longer history of Chinese engagement with the outside world and the indigenization of other types of tobacco and tobacco products that I'm arguing was ongoing and continuous ever since tobacco first arrived in China in about 1550. When viewed not as a totally new Western import, but rather as a variant form of a commodity that was already familiar to millions of Chinese smokers, the cigarette ceases to be emblematic of revolutionary transformations set in motion by the West, and instead becomes an ordinary object of everyday use, creatively appropriated by the Chinese in much the same way that other imported tobacco products had been in earlier centuries. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward here to the 21st century and say that China has entered a new era of globalization, a new phase of globalization, as the world's leading producer and consumer of tobacco in the world today. In terms of production, Chinese farmers grow 1/3 of the world's tobacco crop. The Chinese state-run tobacco industry, the China National Tobacco Corporation, produces 40% of the world's cigarettes. That's currently, in 2013, 2.4 trillion cigarettes per year. And by the year 2015, the volume is projected to increase to 2.75 trillion sticks, or trillion cigarettes. In terms of consumption, most of these 2.4 trillion cigarettes are actually sold in China, and currently less than 2% are exported. In a population of 1.3 billion, there are more than 300 million smokers in China today, and that's 1/3 of all smokers worldwide. Currently, 54% of men over age 15 smoke, and this, by the way, is down from 60% in 2002, so there's some movement in terms of people stopping to smoke or not beginning to smoke, and only 2.4% of Chinese women do. And by the way, there's a whole story about why Chinese women stopped smoking, because as I've argued, in the Qing period, they were just as prevalent smokers as men, but that's a whole nother lecture. In any event, as I said, China is now entering a new phase of globalization, of globalizing. Currently, imports of cigarettes are quite low. With more than 300 million smokers, China is certainly a sought-after market for transnational tobacco corporations, which were excluded from Chinese markets between 1952 and 1978, 1979. So there was a period of time in which the Chinese market was closed to foreign imports. But 98% of all cigarettes sold in China are produced domestically by the China National Tobacco Corporation and its affiliate companies. China is currently seeking to export its cigarette products, and it's pursuing 3 strategies to do so. First of all, it's exporting Chinese cigarettes to markets around the world. In 2010, it exported 19 billion cigarettes, which is about 1% of its total production, to 56 countries across 6 continents. Secondly, it's establishing factories, cigarette factories abroad in places like Romania, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And thirdly, it's pursuing international partnerships with transnational tobacco companies, leveraging access to Chinese markets in exchange for channels to sell Chinese tobaccos to the places that transnational companies are already well established, particularly in emerging markets like Eastern Europe and Latin America. So, I haven't been to the market. I don't know if there's Chinese brands in Qatar, but you might have a look out on it. But we should expect to see more Chinese brands in international markets in the future. And I just want to close by saying that I hope I've persuaded you that the history of tobacco from 1550 forward demonstrates that with the exception of a brief time in the 1950s and 1960s, China was not closed off from the historical currents that gave rise to what is now a $697 billion industry, a global cigarette industry. Although China has entered a new stage in its participation in the globalized culture of tobacco by exporting its own cigarettes to markets around the world, this is hardly the first point or the first time that in this process of engagement. For more than 300 years, tobacco, originally imported into China from the New World, has been an integral part of Chinese culture and society. And as I pointed out, this is not the first time China has been exporting its tobacco products to other countries. So tobacco's centuries-long career in China sheds light on China's long-standing participation in trans-regional and international networks of trade, its participation in the emerging early modern global economy, as well as that of the modern era, and it illuminates ongoing modalities of Chinese adaptation of foreign things, ideas, and practices. As such, it confirms the conclusions of many scholars besides myself who've long argued that China has been energetically engaged with the outside world, not only in the very recent past, but for centuries. Thank you very much.